videos after this. Hi, I'm Dr. Montagna. We're continuing the series on Candida, leaky gut. Candida being one of the roots of most all chronic illness. It's involved with most of the chronic illnesses that are out there. This section is on hormonal dysregulation. This one is really, really different. We're going to cover a few things in this that are real eye-openers. The first one is that men and women have the same problems. We're going to go over why that is embryologically. Then we're going to go through all of the hormonal systems to show how that affects us. So this might be the most interesting and different of all the videos in this series. But it's critical to know all these parts to know how to deal with this. So when we start to look at men and women, women typically look at themselves and they never see themselves how they really are. Beautiful women with figures that a lot of women would dream about see themselves as fat and non-attractive when they look at themselves. Why they're made that way, we don't really know. But commonly they just look at themselves and they beat themselves up quite a bit. Men, on the other hand, can look at themselves and see something that's totally out of perspective of what's really there. In an overweight, lumpy body with sags and folds all over, they can see a Hercules or some dream about model in there. It's interesting how we look at each other differently. So it's important to understand this. When we start to look at a woman's reproductive organs, this is where things get really interesting, because this shows that men and women are really the same. This is looking at the reproductive organs from the front side. This is looking at it from the side view. And from the side view, this story makes a whole bunch more sense. In embryology, if a child's going to be a male, the female and the male fetuses look the same up to 7 weeks after conception. At 7 weeks, if the fetus is going to be a male, there's an increase in testosterone. With the increase in testosterone, the ovaries grab the round ligament that holds the whole female reproductive system in place, drops down through the inguinal canal into the labia. The labia become the scrotum. The ovaries become the testicles, and the round ligament become the spermatic cord. The seam in the bottom of the testicles is where the labia fuse together. Then the uterus drops down, wraps around the base of the urethra, becomes a prostate gland. And the clitoris elongates. There are 3 cruxes of the clitoris that are erectile tissues. And that erection happens through nitric oxide and a few other issues that go on. Those 3 cruxes, if it's going to be a male, come together, wrap themselves around the base urethra, and expand to become the penis. If it's a female, one is in each labia majora, and one remains in the clitoris. So with this, it lets us know that we're made the same, our hormones are made the same, and the same issues that cause all the uterine problems in women later in life is what cause all the prostate problems in men later in life. Anybody that thinks testosterone is a problem of prostate function later in life has to ask the question, well then why doesn't that occur in 19-year-olds when the testosterone is the highest? There's not an answer to that. So we'll start to look at the thyroid. The thyroid regulates the typical way that basically everything in our body does. Up in the brain, there's an area of the brain called the hypothalamus that reads our levels of gases, oxygen, carbon dioxide, minerals, hormones, things like that. In the case of hormones, what it reads, it communicates up to the pituitary. The pituitary sends out little hormone messengers to target glands. In this case, TSH, sent out by the pituitary, goes to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland produces an inert hormone called thyroxine. Thyroxine is converted in the peripheral tissues, mostly the liver, mostly actually in the muscle, into T4, T3, T2, and T1. T3 is the most active of all of those hormones in our body. So the thyroid, it controls our metabolic rate, how much calories we burn. With that, it controls our weight. How fast we burn our calories determines whether we're going to deposit them or burn them. The thyroid controls about half of a woman's menstrual cycle, and it's responsible for 60% of the miscarriages that go on with women. Highly overlooked and ignored. This study right here lets us know that the thyroid can be overwhelmed with toxicity and start to be unable to do its job properly. The thyroid gland regulates our ability to make energy at rest by controlling mitochondria. Mitochondria are controlled by the thyroid. The thyroid tells every cell in our body how many mitochondria they should have, how big those mitochondria should be, and how active those mitochondria are. That's where the Krebs cycle that makes all of our energy, or the bulk of our energy in our body, occurs. It's also related to PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome, in the fact that the thyroid is 50% of the cycle. It's commonly ignored in this, and it also decreases the energy of the cells to be able to react properly. So it's really part of the hormonal dysregulation that goes on within this. So if your body looks like this, lumpy, bumpy, extra weight everywhere, you probably have some thyroid dysregulation problems. After that, we're going to go to the adrenal. It's regulated pretty much the same way. The hypothalamus reads different levels of adrenal hormones. That communicates to the pituitary. Pituitary sends signals down into the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands that are our stress glands, they control our inflammation, our immune responses through the inflammation. They regulate our blood sugar in a huge way, our stress blood sugar mostly. They make the precursors for all of our sexual hormones, both men and women. All the precursors are made in the adrenals, and the adrenals are trying to deal with too much stress, as we'll see a little bit later. They can't make the precursors to our sexual hormones. We start to lose our sexual identity. They also control our kidney function. They control how much water we excrete by how much minerals we reabsorb, and they regulate our postural blood pressure. So the adrenal gland can also be overwhelmed by toxins, and this is one of the main causes of HPA, or hypothalamus pituitary adrenal dysregulation. With that, if we add the thyroid and the gonadal hormones, we have reached the point where we have total dysregulation of all our hormones, and the toxicity from dysbiosis with Candida can be a major cause of that. So here's the regulation: hypothalamus talking to the pituitary, talking down to the adrenal glands. This is a classic look of a body with adrenal dysfunction. A loose, large abdomen, typically with folds that hang over a belt line. With men, you start to have the man boob changes that start to go on with that, and atrophy of large muscles. You notice the arms look abnormally thin compared to the torso. The torso gets thick broad-wise and in depth with adrenal dysfunction. This is relating how this responds to the HPA dysregulation. And when that starts to occur, or one of the mechanisms that starts to occur is through the pregnenolone steal through the aromatase enzyme that's in our fats. Aromatase is one of the many hormones that are produced within our fats. When we're in chronic stress, the aromatase will start to convert the precursors that come out of the adrenal glands, DHEA and pregnenolone, into cortisol, our inflammatory hormone, and it robs the gonads of the precursor it needs to be able to make our sexual hormones. In a woman, that will be progesterone. That gets converted into testosterone. Testosterone gets converted into the estrogens. That occurs in both men and women, just at different degrees in both of them. So aromatase is turned on by insulin and cortisol. Cortisol is a chronic inflammatory hormone. Insulin rises because cortisol liberates proteins. The proteins get converted in the liver into sugar. That rise our blood sugar. With a rise in blood sugar, insulin tries to chase the sugar back into our cells. Insulin and cortisol together turn on aromatase, and that converts our testosterone into estrogens, along with the pregnenolone steal, is beating up the hormone regulation even more. In women, it can take healthy estrogens and turn them into toxic estrogens. So when we couple thyroid and adrenal dysregulation with the pregnenolone steal and aromatase conversion, we have the basis of sexual hormone dysregulation, incomplete dysregulation of all the hormones. Then the body loses its guidance, and it'll start to look like, in males, this is real common with chronic adrenal fatigue going on, commonly linked to Candida and dysbiosis. This is a extreme picture of dysregulation in a woman. She has dysregulation of every hormone that there is in this picture. That point is avoidable when you deal with things. So when we look at the sexual hormones, it starts off with the pituitary releasing gonadotropin. Or actually, it's when the pituitary releases follicle-stimulating hormone, that goes down to the gonads. That makes the gonads start to produce their reproductive cells. In the ovaries, there's a bunch of cells around each egg that makes an ovarian follicle. As that matures, it creates fluid around it, and that maturing follicle is where the pregnenolone, DHEA get converted into her estrogens and progesterone in a huge way. Estrogen is the first side of the cycle, as well as her peripheral tissues. When the estrogen level gets to a certain point, the hypothalamus reads that, says, oh, we're ready to ovulate. It sends out its secondary hormone called luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone tells the mature follicle to ovulate. The follicle bursts open, releases an egg with a fluid. The fallopian tubes catch that egg, or are supposed to, and the maturing follicle turns into a corpus luteum. The corpus luteum is what makes progesterone. Progesterone is what balances off all of the hormonal cycles that go on with a woman. When women cease to ovulate, she doesn't balance. And that can happen in early years as well as perimenopausal and postmenopausal times. But when she stops ovulating during her cycling years, she doesn't produce the progesterone to balance everything out, and she becomes very symptomatic. So this is typically what all those cycles do with the lining of the uterus. But understand, the same thing is going on within the gonads in a male, making him produce sperm, peripheral tissues are making testosterone as well as the gonads making testosterone. So when we look at hormonal balance, there's a lot involved with it. Our foods have a lot to do with inflammation and toxicity, both in the gut and systemically. Our gut controls hormones and nerves in a huge way through crosstalk and different mechanisms. Different studies have shown that the microbiota can produce every hormone and every neurotransmitter our body makes. So when we disrupt the microbiota, it can start to make disruptive hormones, as well as through the toxic pathways. The liver, through its ability to detox, and blood sugar has a lot to do with our hormone pathways. The brain, through its hormonal regulation and crosstalk. The thyroid, with its energy relating to women's cycles and men's energy and his ability to produce his gonadal cells or his reproductive seeds also. The adrenals with hormonal dysregulation, sugar and swelling that goes on, and with the gonads with our sexual hormones. With the sexual hormones in a woman, estrogen, E1, that's estrone. That typically causes fire in postmenopausal women. And that's what's linked into cancer, breast changes, fluid retention, cramps. Estradiol is more of a calming, cycling hormone, more prevalent in women in their cycling years. It's still there in menopausal women, but at really low levels. And estriol is the pregnancy hormone. It's the most calming of all the estrogens. It's typically made mostly in the placenta. Estrogen creates all the engorgement issues that go on with the women, the enlargement of the breast, the proliferation of the lining within the uterus, the swelling throughout the body of different fluids, different things like that. It's highly linked into migraine problems, fluid retention. Progesterone is more the calming side, and it calms all of those fires down and helps calm the emotions down with that. When the progesterone isn't made because the woman is not ovulating, she's really in inflammatory fire and a lot of trouble. So once we hit our older years, postmenopausal and elderly in men, nearly 50% of the sexual hormones in men are made in the peripheral tissues. Almost all of the sexual hormones are made in women's peripheral tissues once she stops cycling. This is going on even when she does cycle. Most just want to focus on the gonads, but the rest of the body's got a big part in it also. So when we start to look at the hormones that are normally there in hormonal replacement therapy, and we cover this in another video, but when we start to add Premarin, most of that's estrone. Doesn't make sense to give women inflammatory hormones when she's already in an inflammatory stage. And the rest of the hormones that are in there are mostly horse hormones. They're highly toxic and create all kinds of toxic reactions within a woman. So as I said, we go over that in another video with autoimmunity in much more depth, but it's important to introduce that here. Then when we look at diabetes, diabetes is commonly an end-stage burnout of long-term adrenal fatigue. Because with it, the blood sugars start to rise. That's usually adrenal dysfunction from chronic cortisol overproduction, making the liver convert proteins into sugars and dump the sugars into the bloodstream. With that, the blood sugars rise, insulin rises to try and catch up with that. It gets to the point where the cells quit responding to the insulin, so they put out more insulin. so we go through the scenario of rising blood sugars, rising insulin, insulin resistance, end stage total dysregulation of insulin can occur. And with that, we have food intolerances creating autoimmunity into the beta cells in the pancreas. By the way, with diabetes, we've had people who couldn't even regulate their blood sugars with insulin get totally off insulin and regulate their blood sugars in their 80s just through food control. So we look at all of that, and we see the insulin resistance as part of the response in the PCOS, bringing everything back into full circle. So if you like this video, hit the like down below, subscribe to our channel. We'll be back with more videos.